All right, well, thanks very much. Appreciate you being here. I'm George, WB5OIP. And you're probably wondering, it's kind of an unusual talk for a ham radio group to talk about a military electronics company and television, but we'll see how it goes. And I try to do these open. If there's anybody has any question or thing, yell out, and I'll try to address it. I'll try to pack quite a few things in a short amount of time here. So, how did hey, Master? So how did I get into this business of talking about Bendix? Well,
Shall I rotate this?
no,
Can I?
no, it's fine. It's
Okay.
fine, wait. So at one time I played with televisions back when I was a novice. One of the common things to play with back then were just old TVs and such. And so there was another person up in Ohio who also as a teenager played with TV sets. Yeah, there's no clip on it.
All right. Yeah, the clip is going.
Yeah.
Oh,
So at any rate, Mr. McVoy, and he as a teenager played with old TVs, and then he started building some cable systems, and he built quite a few of them around the country. And then in the 90s, he sold them all to Time Warner and became the richest man in Columbus, Ohio. So then what am I going to do with my money? So he started a television museum because he loved playing with old TVs. So if you're coming back from Dayton next time, here's the Dayton Ham Fest, and you're coming through Columbus on the return trip on Sunday afternoon, you take the jog here and don't go into Columbus. Just before you get to Columbus, you take the road north, exit to Hilliard, Ohio. Just a few miles up the road is the Television Museum. It's a fun place for anybody that likes electronic stuff. They have televisions from back in the 1920s here, 20s and 30s. 30s and 40s. They have color televisions from the early 50s, the earliest sets made, like these old 15-inch sets here. Most of them are restored and working. There's, in fact, a couple of Hallicrafter television sets made in the late 40s. Recognize the cabinet. I think they used it on the S40B or something. But every year they have a convention, and they have an auction and a flea market. No S-lines, but lots of old TV chassis. So at any rate, being one of these odd TV people, I go to that. They also have a TV picture tube rebuilding facility they're trying to recreate, since almost all of them in the world are gone. So they have a problem of finding parts for their old CRTs, so they're trying to recreate that. So I got to looking at a topic for their convention, and I was looking on the web at the Museum of Industry in Baltimore, and I ran across the Bendix Radio Foundation. And so I looked on their web page, and they had a list of projects, and it included color television in 1946. So I contacted them and said, what information do you have on it? They said, we don't have anything. We didn't even do it. And I said, well, it says right here, well, look, come up and talk to us. I did. I went up there. I walked in, and there's about 8 guys, at least my age and older, and they're ready to tell me everything in the world about Bendix. Now, you never met a group of guys who are engineers. They're extremely proud of Bendix Radio Corporation. They're extremely proud of all the things they did. And they hold all the archives to the company in a little room about half this size up in an old warehouse in Baltimore. Then that's hosted by the Baltimore Museum of Industry. So they were very kind to give me a bunch of pictures, and I'll show you these tonight and show you some history of Bendix and how they actually did build a color TV set in 1946, what happened to it, why were they building a color TV in 1946, and what happened to what happened in these early days of color TV. And it turned out there was a war of major proportions between various, 2 big captains of industry, so we'll get into that. Again, if you have any questions, please holler, and we'll address them as best we can. So they said the first thing you want to do is get a hold of this book called Call Me Pat. So the Baltimore the company was started by this gentleman, Pat Hyland. He's learned radio in World War I, had a number of different work that was in the Army, did stuff for the Navy, and he started a radio company in 1932 in D.C. called the Radio Research Company. And he did a lot of special projects for the Naval Research Laboratory. And so ultimately in '36, he sold his company to Bendix Aviation Corporation, and it became known as Bendix Radio Division of Bendix. And then in '37, they consolidated their operation into Baltimore, into this, which was an old carburetor factory from General Motors. And then they built a big building in '42. And to go on in the picture, the Bendix Corporation, as many of you know, was purchased by Allied later on, and that's what happened to Bendix. And Mr. Hyland was kind of pushed out of Bendix around 1954, but he was interviewed and was personally selected by Howard Hughes to run the entire Hughes aircraft empire, and he did that from 1954 to 1984 when he retired from Hughes Aircraft Corporation. So it is a very interesting book. I highly recommend it. Here's a guy who just through a lot of life experiences became an outstanding executive and was able to handle tremendously large companies and how to manage all the operations in them. So this was later in start of World War II was the Bendix Radio Company there. One of the things that he did early on was he patented a way to get rid of airplane interference. They told me, hard to believe, that the way the pilots used to communicate on airplanes, you could receive the airplane on the ground fine, but trying to hear the radio stations in radio communication in the plane was a problem due to ignition interference. So the pilots would get some altitude, then cut the engine, do their radio communication and glide, and then start the engine again and go on. Hard to believe, but I guess they did. I asked, and they did have electric starters back then. But at any rate, he developed and patented a really good way of shielding the spark plug and all the wires. The pilots just didn't trust this stuff. And that was kind of his original claim to fame, and that got him recognized by Bendix and how they wound up buying him out in the 30s. So they did a number of, like I said, projects. They were involved with the Navy Research Lab, and and during World War II, they started building radars and all kinds of equipment here. This was from a brochure that showed what they did during the war. One of their claims to fame was in the late 30s. Again, it was because the Naval Research Lab was trying to address a problem the British had with a radio they had developed called a TR-1143. It was an aircraft radio that they had built. Apparently it didn't work very well. So the Naval Research Lab got Hyland's company to redesign it. And it was known in the U.S. as the SCR 522. Some of you may have run across that nomenclature. But this was used in an ad by Bendix Radio where they said that the pilot who found the Bismarck reports during the course of action and reception was perfect. The first sighting signal went through like a flash and it was logged in the operations room in 5 minutes. Ships listening on the same frequency got the Bismarck in the shortest possible time. All credit due to the American workers who produced the Bendix radio set. My congratulations, the Minister of Aircraft Production in the UK. So this was the bad news for the Bendix. So that was where they, these guys up there told me they had taken the British radio, they had to make it plug compatible to the original British radio. They redesigned the RF sections and made it more efficient and more stable and did a lot of things. And it came out as this radio. The project was under the code name of King George when they were doing it in the late 30s because the U.S. wasn't supposed to be supplying military hardware to before the war. But at any rate, they produced about 1,000 of those sets. They were a big success. They were also used in the U.S. Here's SCR 522 there. There's another one there. So it shows them on American planes. They also wound up on the surplus market as a 2-meter rig, and this is some guy as his novice station with a 2-meter AM radio on in 1958. There's an SCR 522 right in there. And there's a junk power supply built for it and stuff. So they wound up being used by hams as well. Bendix Radio in '44, one of their big popular projects was this radio compass. Was an automatic direction finder. It unambiguously told you what direction you were flying towards a non-directional beacon in the low frequency band. They made transmitters for airports and all the equipment to go with that. Some of you may remember the old LM221 frequency meter. That was also a Bendix design. They made a lot of different pieces of test equipment back in that era. Their aircraft product line grew and grew. This was from 1966, a bunch of different projects that they had done. Here is a bunch of radars. Some of the people there that I talked to had personally designed sections of these radars, and it was just an amazing array of products that they had built. So if you ask them to build something with RF or whatever frequency, they had somebody that knew how to do that. They built a lot of security equipment starting back in the 60s. One of the gentlemen I talked to there had designed personally a machine called the KG-13 that people have worked with. These were later machines, but the ones that they had pictures of. Some of the other pieces they've got there in their little museum in the warehouse up there in Baltimore. So this was from a book where it said that after World War II, they went out of the war production, and the research department of Bendix Radio announced that they had satisfactory progress towards the perfection of color television. Pretty interesting after World War II, right? So this was one of the things they were working on then was, like it said, we're going to start building radios and things for the consumer market. So they built car radios, over 8 million car radios. They had their own transistor factory up in New Jersey. They built the first transistor AM/FM. So they had quite a production line on that. They started building home televisions in '48. And they ran up until about 1956. They never really produced a color set on the market. They were all black and white sets. Here was a picture of their assembly line, and I thought it was really interesting. This lady standing right here, it looks like she's got some side cutters in her hand or something, or some pliers, right? Now, what do you bet that she knows every part in that television set? And when somebody goes to put something in the wrong place, or did, she's got her cutters there ready to correct the situation. Is the way that's the way I interpreted that picture. I just loved that picture of her standing there watching the folks build those sets. Here's a line of testing those old TVs probably before 1950. 10-inch round picture tube. One of the things they got asked to do was in 1952. Harry Truman decided that he wanted to watch television on the way to the convention in Chicago. So they asked, Bendix got tapped to do this, and so they found a way to get power onto the plane. They were trying to figure out how to get an antenna and get the TV set on there for Truman so that he could watch himself take off and watch convention things on the way to Chicago and then watch himself land. You know, they said, all right, we'll give it a shot. So they were trying to find an antenna for this thing, and they found out by accident that Capital Airlines had actually done a TV installation at one time, but they didn't know whatever happened or who did it. So it turned out that the Bendix guys were, this is out of the newsletter from 1952, the Bendix newsletter, and it said these guys were running around the airport trying to find pieces for this thing or what to do, and the president's pilot wanted nothing to do with putting his antenna on the airplane. And so they hopped a ride with this truck driver for Capital Airlines, and he overheard them talking about they needed an antenna. And he said, oh, that antenna's in my basement. The company threw it away. So they got it out of his basement, got it mounted on the airplane, got the TV set mounted on there, and Truman got to watch himself take off and land, and said he was the first person to have had such an experience there, it says. And so there was the model of TV they did, and that's Truman's airplane called the Independence. So on the color business, I started digging into some of the old magazines on American radio history. Everybody know about American radio history? It's a great website with just all these great magazines. So I started searching through there, and this was Billboard magazine in '46. It says, this week there's going to be a demonstration of a new color video receiver by Bendix Aviation. And it says they're ready to produce the set in quantity by spring if the FCC authorizes color. So we're getting, this is where I'm going to start diverging a little into what was going on back then about the color, so you kind of get the picture of what they were doing in the middle of this. So At any rate, here was another headline. It says, "New Bendix Color TV to be shown. The video jumbos prepare for FCC battle." And they're straining at the leash for the hearing on color standards, which opens December 9th in 1946. Here's a picture from 1940. This gentleman here is Dr. Peter Goldmark. He was the guy at CBS who was pushing CBS network to build color, do color transmissions. The gentleman on the right is the program director. This gentleman in the middle is a guy named Charlie Chaplin, who was a famous actor back in silent films. He was a British guy. But anyway, the deal was they had color TV. They were showing some slides here. It was 343 line RGB, and I'm going to pass around. If you want, get that and slide it, pass it around. I've got a little color wheel here so you can see what a color wheel looks like. But the idea is that you transmit successively images of red, blue, green. And so they had, for this demonstration, they had a 25-watt transmitter in the Chrysler building. Back then, these experimental stations had ham-type calls, so they were W2XAB. This was a prototype receiver that CBS had built. It was running in the band they were trying to get the FCC to approve was 480 to 920 megahertz. As you probably know, we didn't really have high-power transmitters for that band back then. So with the attenuation in that band, people like RCA said, we don't think this is a good idea. You know, VHF works, but there's an awful lot of attenuation at UHF. But CBS said, no, that's where we want to put it because we want to use a 16 megahertz wide channel on there so to get the full color signal. So at any rate, they were proposing this 27 channels allocated over that band. They had different methods, but you can see here's the color wheel that spins in front of this little, I think it's probably a 5-inch, and there's the motor to drive it. It's almost as big as the CRT. Here was another 1946 prototype that CBS had made. Has a 10-inch picture tube in it, and then there's a wheel in front of this thing. There's the motor that drives it. This was a General Electric set that was built for CBS. It may have only been one of a kind. Here's the color wheel, and you can see the neck of the CRT here, and it's pointed down, and it shines through that color wheel and onto what's called a Schmidt mirror that then focuses the image up onto this ground glass screen. So this was over twice the scan rate of the normal TVs at the time, but they did produce that set to have in the hearing. This was a transmitter that they had built for them by Federal Telephone Radio. It has the power of 1 kilowatt peak power at 485 megahertz, but it's able to be modulated 10 megahertz wide. Uses grid modulation typically. At any rate, this was part of the equipment that CBS had built for them for their demonstration in 1946. They had Westinghouse building equipment for the film pickup. I'll show that in the next slide. This was the film projector camera, ran 16 millimeter film. It looks like probably about a 5 kilowatt arc lamp or something shining through that 16 millimeter film to get enough light onto this camera pickup tube in there. But that was, they would run a travelogue over and over, and that was what they were demoing as the motion. They did have a studio camera that they could show people as well. So these hearings were held at New York City and at Princeton, New Jersey at the RCA facility. RCA wanted to show them that we too have a system. RCA was demonstrating a simultaneous system. As it points out down here, no, it's down at the bottom of the screen, but it was RCA was saying, well, ours is 14.5 megahertz wide. CBS wants 16 megahertz wide. And it says CBS and Bendix showed receivers of identical design. That's the Bendix receiver there. There's the FCC commissioners, and there's Peter Goldmark testifying. Over on the right are some black and white sets. Here's another view from a different magazine, and you can see this big set over here, and that's what we hadn't really run across before, was a picture of that Bendix color receiver. Bendix people in Baltimore don't have anything on it. Apparently all that stuff was dumped when they quit making TVs around 1956. But this was the hearing where you can see the press only, and these are all the people from the various companies who are there listening to and testifying about this color system and trying to convince the FCC to approve color TV standards. This picture shows, again, the Bendix receiver. This gentleman on the left is Alan B. Dumont. Before there was Tektronix, Dumont was the oscilloscope company. The gentleman here is Elmer Engstrom, who was VP of Research at RCA, and this is Peter Goldmark, and he's twiddling some knobs here on the Bendix prototype. So when they were doing the testifying, Goldmark said that Bendix and GE are now making receivers, CBS color. Bendix's radio chief of research testified they're building a 600 megahertz color transmitter and has orders for 50 receivers. And also there was another article in Televisor in '46 that said Bendix and Westinghouse are licensed under CBS patents to make UHF color transmitters and equipment. Yes?
I was just wondering if that just has founded the Dumont television network.
It is. I'll talk about that in a second. Yeah. So here's another magazine article. It was talking pretty lengthy, and it showed the teams, the RCA team and the CBS team, and various people all standing there very sternly, and the FCC folks in their three-piece suits who are listening to all the testimony on this. So ultimately, as a result of those 1946 hearings, the FCC rejected the CBS system. They said it hadn't been tested enough, and they cannot escape the conclusion that many of the fundamentals have not been adequately field tested. And it's true. They were trying to get something adopted. Alan Dumont was a little more straightforward on his comments. Now, Dumont, as you mentioned, had this huge company that built test equipment. They built television cameras. They built home receivers for television. They built television transmitters. They built a lot of stuff. And so Dumont said a 6-year high-pressure campaign by CBS to foist onto the industry and public an inherently defective system of color television draws to a conclusion. The CBS system is unscientific. It would set television back. It's sheer amateurishness. I don't know why he didn't tell us what he really thought, but this was, but that was Dumont's. So then, not to be dismayed, eventually the FCC in May of '49, they said, all right, we're going to hold more hearings on this color TV business. There's a clamoring for color. CBS was pushing them for it. So they said, they said in May of 1949, we're going to have hearings on this in September. So Sarnoff, the RCA lab, canceled all vacations and started working 7 days a week to refine their simultaneous color system. CBS took their old system they had shown in '46 and narrowed it back. So they cut the resolution of it down, went from 525 line TV to 405 line, so that they could cram it into the existing 6 megahertz television channel that had been allocated. So on September '49, the FCC hearings began. They had 62 days of testimony, 53 witnesses, 265 exhibits, and I'm sure a lot of hollering and hooping. This was the RCA submittal. They got it in the door the afternoon of the deadline of September in '49. Does anyone recognize this gentleman who is the project leader? Do you know what he's also famous for? Pardon? I like that. That's good. Yeah. Brown was their antenna expert. He was, if you've read ever heard of the paper about how many radials does it take on a verdict, that was he was one of the co-authors of that paper and probably the leader on that. So he was their expert on directional antenna arrays. He did the ground plane antenna, a bunch of things, but he was the project leader for this color compatible system. And so they're trying to figure out, they said, well, we got this simultaneous system. Well, how are we going to get it in a 6 megahertz channel? So as you know, RCA Communications had a big facility out on Long Island. And they had some people out there wrote Brown a letter and said, we've got some guys out here working on something called time division multiplex. And we think that might be a way to solve some of this color TV problem that you're trying to get going. So they said, come on down, and they had them come to the Princeton lab, and they started working on that. And so as you can see here, they didn't have a tricolor CRT. They had to view 3 separate CRTs through what they call dichroic mirrors and project it at the time. The tricolor CRT came a little later. But what they did was RCA took the red, blue, green cameras and then multiplexed them, and this is sequencing at about 3.9 megahertz. So they're sampling red, blue, green, and they did that with low-pass video, and then they took high-frequency information, just took it all and crammed it back on in an adder out here, and then it went through the transmitter and out to the antenna. But in essence, what Sarnoff was trying to get them to do is say, I want to watch color on a black and white set and black and white on a color set. You got that, guys? And the engineer's like, boss, that's impossible, you know, forget it. Well, this is how you do it. And this did work. And it actually made color pictures. It didn't make the best black and white pictures, but it did work. And so they had the right idea. And so when you build TV sets or radios, you need to license manufacturing, unless you've got your own patents on how to build super heterodyne radios and things. So RCA was a licensee. You could go to them and get a license to build TVs and radios. Another company that was a licensee, a big company in that, was a company called Hazeltine. They were primarily a military manufacturer, but they had a group working on television. And this gentleman, of course, he was in his early days a ham, named Bernie Laughlin, looked at the RCA dot sequential method and said, you know, I think I've got some improvements that are going to fix it. So because RCA and Hazeltine were cross-licensees, Brown came to Long Island, looked at Laughlin's system, and immediately went back and added those features to the RCA. Yes, sir?
Which one is the channel controller?
Oh, I don't know the answer to that. I just thought that looked impressive, you know. But I'll tell you that the interesting thing was, later FCC said, boy, is this complicated, you know. This color wheel is a much simpler thing, you know. Yeah, well, you know, it's a prototype. So at any rate, Dumont is trying to say, look, this is ridiculous. If you're going to put a color wheel in front of a CRT and spin it, look how big, a 10-inch, yes, but if you've got to have a big TV set. And so they built this and took it down to the Commerce Building to show to the FCC commissioners. And to show, this is ridiculous, guys. So yes, Dumont Television Network, they had a lot of shows. Jackie Gleason shows were on the Dumont network. The reason we get to see Jackie Gleason these days is that big thing there was a Dumont company invention called an electronicam that had a TV camera and a film camera using the same optics. So that's how those old shows survived. They didn't have videotape back in those days. And so anyway, you can see the size of motor it takes to spin this. And this gentleman, this is Dumont. This guy on the right is Thomas T. Goldsmith, who was Dumont's director of research. And now you know why the Dumont station, Channel 5 in Washington, D.C. is WTTG. This Hyland got back into the picture. Again, it's pointed out in his book that he had talked to his people and he said, well, it looks like the FCC is divided, so he thought he would try to influence them. He had a friend on the FCC named Webster. He went down and had a meeting with him, and Webster said, no, I'm totally on the CBS system. And he just happened to notice the office name, another lady named Frida Hennock, who was on the commission. And he knew her, and he went in and talked to her and said, you know, when I was a kid, the big deal was color really enhanced my interest in reading because the comics started printing in color. I think it's important. It's good for education. She said, education, that's the ticket. So she became the big proponent of educational TV, and she tried to sway the commission. But history shows us that it didn't quite get there. She and one other FCC commissioner voted against the CBS system and said it should be delayed until you got the electronic system working. But she was overruled with the rest of the commission. The commission in 1950 put out this report, and I'm sorry it's hard to read. It says the color fidelity of the RCA picture is not satisfactory, the texture is not satisfactory, the receiving equipment utilized by the RCA system is exceedingly complex, the equipment utilized at the station is exceedingly complex. So they rejected the RCA Hazeltine system over the CBS color wheel. So here's a picture of Frank Stanton, who was president of CBS. There's Paley, who was the chairman of CBS. And this issue of December 1950 Time came out and is talking about the controversy and why there's still arguments in industry about which way to go, electronic, simultaneous. But the big deal about this was the CBS system was not compatible. You couldn't watch a CBS color show on a black and white TV. You got like 9 little pictures floating through because it's a different scan rate horizontally and vertically. So the big deal Sarnoff is trying to tell them, and Dumont, you want a compatible system because you've sold all these black and white sets. You're asking people to throw those away and go buy a new color TV. And they're not going to do that. We're just barely getting color into the market now, and you want to obsolete all of these sets. And that was one of the big deals of the RCA system. So industry was not happy. So the FCC approved the CBS system, and RCA took it to court. Other companies did as well. In '51, it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had a decision 8-0, said, well, we're not going to, if a government agency decides that technically that's what it should be, we are going to go along with that government agency. So they decided 8-0. CBS is now authorized to transmit color programming, but there's a problem. Nobody can see it. And so they started, they had this big gala broadcast in 1951 with Arthur Godfrey and all these big stars, but there were only about 50 televisions in existence that could see the pictures. The people at RCA Labs had one that they had made, the people at Hazeltine had one they had made, and the rest of them were either the monitors around the CBS studio and those things, but no one else had TVs to watch the shows. So as soon as CBS went into color mode, people changed the channel because they couldn't see the picture, and their ratings went to 0. So after about a week of shooting themselves in the foot daily on this, the FCC said stop, and they quit transmitting color. They did keep doing some shows, but their problem was all the TV manufacturers in the United States says this CBS color wheel system is a bad system. We don't want to build sets for it. And CBS went out to all these TV manufacturers in the US and asked them, you going to build sets for us? And they said, no, forget it. So CBS was up against the wall. Either they're now the one that the FCC says you need to start transmitting color. They have nobody really to build TV sets for this new standard. So they went out and bought a company. So there was a company in Long Island that had that made department store TVs. You know, they sold under the names Gamble's and Sears and things like that, called Air King. And they were owned by a company called Hytron. Some of you may have heard of Hytron tubes. It was an old tube company. So Hytron was owned by these two brothers. CBS arranged to buy the company from these two brothers. They paid them, I think it was $18 million, which was something like they gave them 26% of the stock holdings of CBS. Paley, the president of the company, only owned 13% of the stock, but they paid these two brothers and gave them seats on the board of directors of CBS to get that company so they'd have somebody that would build TV sets. So they started building TV sets, and that's a picture of one of them. The company was called Air King. They had an advertisement in June of '51, and they only built about 100. Some people say a few more, but they were all recalled and destroyed. There's one remaining in the UCLA museum, I understand. I've never seen it. And they finally halted broadcasting color in 1951. Said, we're done. And there's a story behind that. But at any rate, these are the two captains of industry that were duking it out. Paley kind of lost about $50 million out of the deal, he estimates. He ultimately hated his guy Goldmark for almost bankrupting his company. Sarnoff came out okay, although he spent an awful lot of money to get color going. But that standard did run from '53 to 2009 that we knew as NTSC. So finally, I'm going to talk about one other adventure of Bendix into television. Ron's familiar with this, I know. They said, you got to get this book and read about the skate. So Bendix had built a television camera for the Navy, and it's in an unusual housing here, but it was a specialized low-light level camera system. This was in 1959, and it used a camera tube. This camera tube was used in virtually all TV cameras worldwide up until the mid-60s or so when it started being overtaken by another type. But this tube was developed during World War II as a secret project at RCA, and then ultimately after the war it was licensed out to GE and Philips in Holland and English Electric Valve and a lot of companies. And it's a very interesting tube. I'm sorry, do you have a question?
What's a dynode?
A dynode is a piece, that's an element in a multiplier. So what you're doing is, try to go through this. You take the television picture, you focus it onto a photocathode, and it starts kicking off electrons where the light hits the photocathode. These things move across in a field, so it makes an electron image over here on this plate, which is it's a disc about the size of a dollar coin, made out of extremely thin glass. They have an electron gun in the back, just like you have in a regular CRT. They send the beam down here, and then they decelerate it right as it touches that glass target. And so it will pick up any electrons that happen to be on that target at that point on the piece of glass, and then returns them back to the back. And it goes through what's called an electron multiplier. So as it goes through these dynodes, you can think of them as grids in a way, and they're designed to each one with a voltage progression add to the electron flow. So you excite one, it kicks off some more electrons, goes to the next, kicks off some more electrons. So you're amplifying the signal that came back using these elements, and that's what you see is these rings in the back here. And then you collect that signal out, amplify it, and there's your picture. So that's the tube they were using. And so here they had mounted it on this, they put it on this submarine called the Skate. So this was from the newsletter at Bendix. They had an engineer from Bendix who was on the submarine, and he was trying to get the captain, he had everything all set up and was testing it and was trying to get the captain to sign off so he could get off and go home. And he said the meeting never took place. We were informed we were going to the Arctic and would surface the submarine through the ice and would attempt to surface at the North Pole. We would be gone 6 weeks and there would be no radio transmissions until we returned to New London. So Bendix didn't know where he went. His wife didn't know where he went. He had just vanished, and he was on the submarine. They went up and actually went through, the first submarine to go through the ice. They said one of the key instruments was the Bendix low light level TV. So this was a gentleman named Kramer Bach. Looks like a very smiling Mr. Kramer Bach, glad to get back on the land after his trip. Here's the Bendix camera housing with the image orthicon camera in it. There's some images of the ice and the installation there on the submarine. So he had quite an adventure, and this was all written up in the 1959 Bendix employee newsletter for the radio company. This is some other pictures of the solid-state image orthicon camera that they had built. This was a 1963 version. They were building the sync generator out of transistors when almost everyone else was still using tubes at that time. In fact, here's an RCA 1963 image orthicon camera. You can see it's a little bigger, has all tubes. And again, here is the Bendix camera with another view of the camera control unit. They decided they would try to sell some of these to broadcasters. This was another version they made called the BX8. BX just meant Bendix. In 1963, they advertised this one to the broadcasters. ABC started buying some and had used them in Olympics and political conventions. Here was another shot from a book where they're using one of the Bendix cameras on a news set and carrying something you could carry around, which you couldn't do with the other brands of image orthicon camera. Here was another one yet at the Olympics in 1964 that Bendix had built. So that's the story. That's how I got interested in it. They did a lot of things, like I said, extremely proud folks of the Bendix company, and they certainly did make a lot of things over the years and some great innovations. Is there any questions I can answer? Sir?
Just one thing I want to add about Bendix, being the cable guy here in the crowd, we have to thank Bendix Corporation in 1962. They invented the SMA connector.
Yes.
So don't forget that, guys, when you use an SMA, that's
Thank Bendix.
1962.
All right.
For one purpose, to hook a PC board to a waveguide, crank it down 8 inch-pounds, and we
All right, well, thank you. Yes, sir.
Innsbruck has 2 N's and a C.
Oh, sorry about that.
That's invaluable to add.
I'll fix that.
There's a great wiener ball over there, too.
Yeah. Sir,
Who bought out Bendix, or were they run a business, or they had bought out business?
I think it was a hostile takeover by Allied Corporation. Bill has some background on that.
They basically no longer exist. They tried to buy a company called Martin Marietta. And we now know a company called Lockheed Martin. They've had a Martin Marietta. Didn't go along with the Bendix buyout deal. And they over leveraged trying to buy themselves, trying to buy Martin Marietta. And now ceased to exist.
All right, anything else? All right, well, thanks very much. I really appreciate your time.